Not every sexual experience is going to be a gold medal experience.
Right. The last thing you want to do is make it about yourself.
Exactly. If you're worried about pleasing them, you're abandoning your own pleasure. The more you come at your partner with an expectation, entitlement, or any kind of pressure to be sexual, the more likely it is their organic desire is going to go down. If the sex that you're having is not sex that you're really excited about, the desire that you feel to be sexual isn't going to be there, because why do you want to have sex that isn't great sex? Fantasize about something does not mean that you want it in real life, and doesn't mean that if you had that thing happen in real life that you would enjoy it.
Welcome back to the Rena Malik MD podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Rena Malik, urologist and pelvic surgeon. Today, our guest is Dr. Kate Balestrieri. She is a licensed clinical and forensic psychologist, certified sex therapist, and sex addiction therapist. She is also a couples therapist with expertise in the psychobiological approach to couples therapy. She's founder of her own therapy practice called Modern Intimacy and host of her own podcast called Get Naked with Dr. Kate. Today, we talked about how to navigate flirting in a new relationship, as well as how to initiate intimacy. We also discussed when and how to disclose issues with sexual function with your partner and how to navigate performance anxiety. We also discussed why people cheat and if it differs between men and women. We talked about experience mismatch as well as libido mismatch, as well as the most common kinks people are interested in and what that means. We talked about sexual fantasy as well as the triad approach to sex therapy. And lastly, we talked about how to find a sex therapist and the benefits of sex therapy for you. Dr. Balestrieri, Kate, it's such an honor to have you. I'm so excited to have our conversation today.
Oh, me too. Thanks so much for inviting me.
You're so welcome. And your content on social media is so good. It is so helpful to people who are learning about sex and how to navigate relationships, which is a really big issue I see in my patient population. But let's start before relationships. How can people we talk about how foreplay begins in the morning or begins well at the beginning of the date, right? So when you start dating someone for the first time or very early on in the dating relationships, what tips do you have for people in terms of flirting and sort of building that sexual intimacy or desire between the two individuals?
Well, I think flirting actually starts and foreplay actually starts with every interaction that you have, not just the date, but the text that you have, the way you talk to each other. So consider every exchange that you have with a person an opportunity to create connection if that's what you're seeking, and also to really think about building that erotic tension and excitement between the two of you. It's easy to get boring in our text messages back and forth and like, what are you doing? What are you doing? That's right. But really create a lot of enthusiasm before you get going.
And then you said texting. Texting is hard.
It is.
A lot can be misconstrued in a text. Emojis can be thought of as more suggestive or sort of odd. And if you use shorthand, some people find it a turn off. So what are some kind of rules of thumb you have?
I don't think there are any rules. I think you should be authentic. And if somebody's not feeling your vibe, then it's probably not a good fit for you. But if you are really showing up authentically and emojis are your thing, somebody's going to get that and vibe with you there. And they're going to be excited to communicate with you in that way. And if they're not, then maybe it's just not a good connection. I think it's just important not to personalize whenever it's not a good fit, because there's a lot of people out there. We're not going to be a good fit with everyone. And there are going to be some people who really, really understand the way you approach relationships and appreciate it.
Yeah. And in terms of picking up on the other person's feedback, sort of when you're in the date, things that you tell people for that.
It's really important to try to stay present with yourself so that you can stay regulated in your emotions and really attuned with someone else. It's totally easy to get excited or get nervous or anxious and kind of get in your own head and lose the ability to stay present with someone. But when you're staying present and you're able to attune with them and notice their nonverbal communication in addition to their verbal, you can be a lot quicker in checking in with someone. If something feels a little bit wonky or if the joke you made falls flat, you can check in around what happened or let them know what's going on for you too. It's all about communication.
Yeah, communication is tough. It's really hard, especially when you've got a lot of emotion or nerves or anxiety around it. It can be really hard to sort of be your authentic self, one, and two, even like pick up on the nonverbal things. And if you do, not catastrophize about them, right? Because you may not be reading it exactly 100% the way the other person is meaning.
Absolutely.
What about in the very first encounter of trying to initiate sex or intimacy for that matter? How do you think what mistakes do you think people make in that specific instance that can be really detrimental for both women and men?
It's a great question. I think one of the biggest mistakes people make is that they assign value to whether or not they have sex to mean something about the relationship that may or may not be developing. So they conflate sexuality with the trajectory of the relationship. So if you want to be sexual with people, I think it's okay to talk about that and engage if someone else is interested in that. But try not to assume that it means the relationship is going to last or that it won't. Right? We put a lot of meaning on sex that doesn't need to be there. Sex is doing a lot of work, heavy lifting our fears, right? So just, try to keep these two things separate and really engage in sex from a place of pleasure and desire instead of it's got to mean something about my worthiness or whether or not the relationship is going somewhere.
Yeah. Well, what if they're not worried about that, but they just want, of course, like they're sort of wanting to just have that physical connection with the person, not necessarily worried about the relationship itself, but like what are some things that people can do, especially in today's world, right? Where like, obviously we want to consent for everything.
Yes.
We want to be respectful.
Yeah.
And that's sort of a change in terms of like, there was a little bit more when we were growing up, probably a little bit more of like the male dominated role of like pursuing the sexual involvement with the other person. Whereas now it sort of lies with both people. And I think sometimes people feel like, well, I don't want to come across as being too aggressive or make this be misconstrued as not being respectful or not consenting, not getting consent when I try to make a move on someone.
Yeah, I think you're so spot on. We forget sometimes that there's a human behind the other side of the text message or the dating app. It's easy to be quick when you're coming from either a place of not being really present with what you're talking about or the app itself or something like that. But it's also easy to dehumanize people unintentionally and just like have a familiarity or a level of communication that suggests that there's more intimacy than there actually is. So I think it's a really important step to, one, remember that there's a human there, to ask them what they need, talk about what you need, really be open about what you're looking for so you can negotiate from a place that is informed for both of you. And when you can do that, then it's a lot easier to say, okay, great, who's going to grab the barriers or the contraception? Who's going to be responsible for that? What are we doing around our STI conversation? What is meaningful for each person in this exchange? So you can just like be more proactive and set the stage for something that respects each person's agency, their needs, their limits. And again, it really requires people to not personalize other folks' responses, right? They're not saying no to you to hurt you if they have a boundary or a limit. And no one is entitled to another person's body for sexual pleasure. I think we can, again, get really vulnerable and the rejection feels hard and it's hard not to personalize things, but just really remember to slow down and be thoughtful about how you're setting this up with someone.
I think the other thing that I wonder is like in person, right? So having these conversations over text, there's a little bit of a safety zone, right? Whereas like say you haven't had those conversations before you've met, you didn't even think sex was on the table, but then there's this great sexual chemistry between you and the person and you want to have sex and you want to initiate. So that's sort of like, how do you bring up these things? Because of course, safe sex is hot sex, right? If you feel safe and you are actually in that moment with the person, you can allow yourself to be fully vulnerable, which is what you need to have really excellent sex, right? So I think the issue then becomes is like, okay, yeah, I'm really turned on by this person. I'm really aroused. I really want to have sex with them. How do I bring this up in a way, one, that is like not a like, oh, I'm not putting you down and saying you might have an STD. It's just like, I'm being safe.
Yeah.
And two, like, how do you initiate without, again, in person, without disrespecting the person or making them feel perceived as disrespected, or maybe it's too aggressive, or it's, whatever the case may be.
I wish I had an easy answer for you, but the way that people have these kinds of exchanges is really subjective. So one person's green line is another person's red line, right? I think it's important to stay with your own integrity and, again, be respectful. So would I feel good about somebody saying this to me if they said it in this way, right? Now, sometimes that golden rule doesn't really apply because we can't imagine how other people might be hearing our requests or our ideas. But I think it's okay to float out the idea of like, hey, I'm really feeling this chemistry. Are you? And if you're nervous about how someone is going to respond, maybe start with slower increments of feeling out the scenario and ask them questions like, are you feeling it? How do you feel about sex when you first meet someone? Is that something that you're open to? Yes or no? Why or why not? How do you feel about things like condoms or contraception? Like, where do you stand on that? I think when you ask a lot of questions, some people say that kills the mood, but I'm like you, and I think safer sex is hotter sex, and it's better to start from a place of being more conservative in the conversation, and you can build up more if somebody's amenable.
Yeah, that's good. And, I think I just want to share this story. So I was like having a little bit of an argument with my husband the other day, and I realized that like he thought, so I was having an issue and I went to him to say, hey, I made this decision. And instead of him saying, oh, like, how do you feel about that decision? Which is what I sort of wanted him to like, just reassure me that my decision was good. He responded by trying to solve the problem. Right. And I think that some people, particularly, I mean, this is a generalization, but men tend to be problem solvers. So when you go to them with an issue, they want to solve your problem. And sometimes we just want to vent. And so I was like, listen, I was like, you just need to like ask a question. Be like, oh, how do you feel about that? Or what do you think? And let me tell you what I need without me having to tell you what I need. Right. Because I think sometimes people don't realize that like, it's not intuitive, and you may be like, how could you not realize that I needed you to just reassure me, or whatever the case is, right? How could you not see that? But like, everyone's in their own head. Everyone's thinking the way they think, and their intentions are generally good. It's more about just like asking a clarifying question to see where their brain's at before you dive in, And same thing, you'd be like, hey, like, I'm really feeling this. Like, how do you feel about it? And just sort of like let them talk a little bit and hear what they say.
Exactly.
Quick break from this episode to let you know I am so grateful that you're spending part of your day with me. I started creating content online to empower people to learn more about their bodies without needing to go see a doctor, pay a copay, wait in a waiting room, or find parking. And it has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. If you want to help support our mission of providing free education, please consider joining our premium membership. There you will have access to ad-free episodes, which are released early, as well as free transcripts and the opportunity to ask me anything. And these questions are answered in our monthly AMA episodes. Support the show and join today at renamalik.supercast.com. Can't wait to see you there. So now when you're in a relationship, right? I have a lot of men in my audience, and performance anxiety comes up a lot. So having this stress around sex, and then because of that stress, not being able to get an erection. And then for women, it could be not being able to get to orgasm, right? Similarly. And so how do they navigate that? What are things that you offer to men in terms of a sex therapy, and women in these circumstances where stress is the predominant factor? What do you offer for them in ways to work through that?
Slowing down can be really helpful, because when we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to perform, and I am going to put that word in quotes, we're already in our head and out of our body, right? So really slowing down and noticing what actually feels good. How am I responding to the sensations in the moment can be enough to move through some stress or some anxiety. to get out of your head a little bit. But it's really important to not look at sex as a performance. And the minute you start thinking about this as a performance, you're going to be in a place of spectatoring with yourself, where you're kind of watching and critiquing yourself as if you were a fan watching an event, instead of experiencing the sexual pleasure and the experience in your body. And that is the place we really want to be when we're being sexual. It's, our brain is our biggest sex organ, but it really gets in the way in the moment sometimes. So it's important to kind of drop in and try to work on feeling more attuned and slow down with a partner. If you're worried about pleasing them, you're abandoning your own pleasure.
Yeah. So what are some steps that people could take to sort of work on being more present with the sensations?
I'm a big fan of talking about that with your partner and saying, hey, I need to slow down right now. I really want to feel this. And you can make it hot. You can make it sexy and part of the fun. But really talk about, like, in this second, I want to just really be present with this, and have your partner stimulate different parts of your body and just focus on what that feels like. And bring yourselves, just into this place of being curious with one another, experimenting with different ways of touching each other with different parts of your body or different accessories. Bring in different toys and really, investigate, what do we like? What does each of us like? Take turns giving and receiving, so that you get accustomed to saying to each other that not everything is an awesome sensation. And I think that's really important, because when couples and partners can get in the practice of saying, oh, I really like that, or actually that's not my thing, then it's a little bit easier to give that feedback in the moment, and we're not so afraid of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think that one thing you brought up is bring things into the bedroom with you. Now, this can be a scary topic for a lot of people, right? They can feel sort of unsure or nervous about even telling their partner if they want to bring something in. And there's a lot of stigma. Say it's not even a true kink, but even introducing something that's not in the traditional, just our two bodies, right? In the bedroom. How do you help coach people through talking to their partners about that stuff?
Well, I look at those kinds of accessories and ideas as pleasure enhancing. And so they can also be connection enhancing. I think it can be a lot more exciting to talk to your partner about, let's pioneer some new sensations. Let's do something adventurous together. If you were going on a hike or a picnic, you wouldn't just bring your two bodies. You would bring a bottle of water and maybe a map or your phone. You might bring some other accessories to help you on that trail. And sex is the same way. Bring the things that you want and need to make it a more enjoyable experience together, right? And then and talk about with your partner, can you do this to me in this way? And when your partner is a part of what creates the sensory experience, it doesn't really matter if they're doing it with a vibrator or a whip or their hand, right? Can you create those experiences together? Because the vibrator is great, but it can't move itself, right?
Yeah.
So when your partner is a part of the process, you're co-creating something that is unique and can only be experienced with the two of you.
I love that. I love the way of seeing it as something you're doing together, because I think sometimes people feel a lot of times people feel like they're being replaced by this device, this mechanical device. And I always say it's just a tool. It's just another aid. And it's just something that we use to make things more fun and enjoyable. And that's sort of the way you have to think about it. Similarly, in the same vein, what about introducing when you have issues? So you have, say, a man has erectile dysfunction. And we know that 50% of men at 50, 60% of 60, and so on and so forth have erectile dysfunction. And we know that many women have difficulty, and 40% of women have sexual dysfunction, of which 12% are bothered by it. But, how do we introduce these things? Say a man wants to say, look, my penis doesn't work all the time in getting erect. Or a woman wants to say, you know what, I don't orgasm all the time with penetrative sex, which is very normal, as you and I know. And many of my listeners know that many women need clitoral stimulation to climax. But when you're first meeting someone, you may just want to tell them so that they're not disappointed in the moment, and to protect yourself too from maybe a reaction that is sort of not thoughtful in the moment?
I'll answer that question, but first I'll say I just wish we had better comprehensive sex education in this country, because
Me too.
those concerns are so common. Again, I'm a huge fan of just kind of putting it out there. And if somebody responds to you in a way that is unkind, that's about them. That's about their lack of education. And I really hope that it's something you don't internalize, because everyone's bodies have moments of pleasure and response and then moments where they don't.
Yeah.
And that is just to be expected. Not every sexual experience is going to be a gold medal experience.
Right. So, I love saying that it's okay for sex to be mediocre.
It is. Yeah. But we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to have these rock hard erections or be multiply orgasmic and only like 40% of women, at least in the studies, are multiply orgasmic. So I think everyone always says, oh my God, women are so lucky. They can have multiple orgasms, but not all women can, or not all women do. Right. Even if biologically they're capable of it, a lot of women either don't know how, or maybe there's something else going on and they can't, or they've just never investigated that.
Yeah.
Right. And prioritized it. So, and that's okay. You don't have to be like a tantric goddess, orgasming for 72 hours. But
that would be exhausting. I don't
know. Right? Like I would eat some pizza at some point. But I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to be these performative, like rock stars in the bedroom. So I think it's just not only okay, but important to just say like, hey, look, this is what my body's going through right now. And how I'd really love to be supported by you is XYZ. And I'm really looking forward to pleasuring you and myself and each other in all these other ways, right? Like it doesn't have to mean that sex is off the table.
Yeah. And I like to say, if someone has an issue during the bedroom, the last thing you want to do is make it about yourself.
Exactly.
So like oftentimes men will lose an erection in the bedroom, and a woman, or in this case, in a heterosexual relationship, will start feeling like it's about them. And I get that, right? I totally understand that. But that's the worst thing you can do for a relationship. If you're in a one night stand, like it's probably not that serious, but it is going to be damaging to that person. But ultimately, like it's really important to just be like, okay, this happened, no big deal. Right. We can continue if you want to in different ways, or we can stop if you want to, whatever your preference is. Yeah. Are you sick of going to the doctor only to have them talk at you for 15 minutes and leave without knowing exactly why they're prescribing you this certain medication and what exactly the next step is to take to optimize your health? Wouldn't it be great to finally find a doctor who actually listens to you, answers your questions, and doesn't rush you out the door? Well, at my practice, Rena Malik, MD, I aim to do just that. I specialize in taking care of patients who have issues with their sex lives, issues with their bladder, with their hormone health, or are having pain in their pelvic region or with sex. My goal is to give you the time and attention you deserve so you can leave with a clear understanding of your condition, as well as our treatment plan that's optimized for your goals. During your visit, I'm 100% present with you for an entire hour. And after you leave, you can reach me. It is super easy to send me a message through our secure portal, and I'll get back to you within 24 to 48 hours. No questions asked, no hidden fees. Scheduling is easy. Just visit our website, renamalikmd.com/appointments. We see patients in both Irvine and Beverly Hills, California, and I see patients virtually in California, Florida, Illinois, Maryland, New York, New Jersey, and Virginia. Oh, and don't forget Texas. If you're outside these states, consider seeing me for an educational visit. I look forward to seeing you. The other big thing that comes up often, and I'm sure you talk about this a lot with your clients, but libido mismatch, right? Meaning one partner has really high desire and the other one doesn't. So some of my audience asked, like, how do you ask for more sex? And, I didn't want to ask that specific question because I think the issue is like, there's no right amount of sex, and it's a relationship issue. It's like finding out what is the right balance between the two of you and what works. So let's talk about sort of your approach to that when you're talking to couples.
Sometimes there is sort of a baseline desire discrepancy for people, But often what is actually happening is there are barriers to desire that have not been removed. And so my first approach is to look at what's actually getting in the way of somebody feeling excited for sex. And Emily Nagoski has done a lot of writing about this in her books, Come As You Are, and her newest book, Come Together. And she uses really interesting language called pleasure accessible headspace or a pleasure averse headspace, right? And when we think about desire, there are often far more barriers to desire than there are yeses to desire. So the first thing that I look at as a sex therapist is what's going on in their relationship, in this person's life. What are the no's? What's getting in the way of people finding the sex that they want interesting and being able to prioritize it if there is a desire issue, but also like what's happening relationally that maybe someone might be shut down if that is part of the equation. So looking for the barriers first and trying to help couples work together to remove the barriers is step number one, but not in a transactional way. Not in like okay, you're tired, you don't want to do the dishes, I'll do the dishes, but then let's go have sex. That creates a lot of pressure and expectation, and that transactionality for a lot of people, especially for women, just, removes their desire even more and puts more inhibition in place. Because sexual entitlement, there have been some really great studies about this, but sexual entitlement has a really strong inverse relationship to desire in the other partner, right? So the more you come at your partner with an expectation, entitlement, or any kind of pressure to be sexual, the more likely it is their organic desire is going to go down.
That's crazy. And it goes the other way too. Sometimes you'll find that women will be like, okay, if you do XYZ chore, then I'll have sex with you. And so they're weaponizing sex almost, or not weaponizing, but they're using sex as a bargaining chip.
Yes, which I don't recommend doing, right? Because that does create then this transactional experience of sex and collaboration with the things at home that need to happen. But if your partner is not participating in the emotional labor or the domestic labor of your household, it's going to probably be really hard for you to see them as a partner and not as another dependent, right? So I understand why a lot of women do that, even though I don't recommend it.
Yeah, exactly. There was a paper about the theory of heteronormativity and how oftentimes when women feel like they're doing the large load of the domestic work, and of course this is not a generalization. People always come at me saying like, well, I do plenty at home, and this is not a generalization, but I think when women feel like they're doing the majority of the work at home, they then almost feel like they're mothering their partner, and nobody wants to have sex with their child.
Nope.
Yeah. So I think it's really important to sort of like address that in your relationship. And even if you are doing all the right things, like in your mind, it's still important to just check in.
Yeah, it's so important to check in because your evaluation of what's happening at home may be very different than your partner's evaluation of what's happening. And I think this is a place where partners really get in trouble because they'll say, well, I'm doing enough. But who said that? Did you get your partner's buy-in on that? Does your partner feel that way? Or have you just decided this is the limit of what you can do? And that's a different scenario than saying I'm doing enough. So I think we have to get more curious as partners about how each person feels and actually if what you're contributing does offset the mental load that your partner is holding, because those are two very different realities. And I work with a lot of partners who are so well-intentioned and they're doing what they think their partner wants them to do around the house, but they're missing the mark because that communication piece isn't there. And so it builds resentment then for both of them, which of course is a desire killer.
Yeah. And I think expectations need to be assessed, right? So someone who may have low desire because they feel overworked, their expectations may be unreasonable at times, right? So I think it goes both ways. It's sort of realizing like, okay, everyone is focused on themselves. Like, let's be realistic. Like I'm always thinking about how I feel before I think about how my partner feels, right? And so I might think like, look, I need more help. And my partner is like, I do the dishes, I cook every day, I do all these things. And you're not even seeing them anymore because you're so used to it, right? It's just become a normal part of what I do. And so you're not even appreciating that. And then I am doing a lot. Like I do all these things and I have to be reminded, right, that my partner is always taking care of the kids when I'm doing other stuff, that my partner is doing the dishes, that my partner cooks all the meals for our family. And I oftentimes forget because I'm like, I could use some help too with all the things I'm doing. In which case, like, we need to hire someone else, right? Or we need to find someone else to help to reduce that load for both of us, right? And that's not always feasible for everybody, but like ultimately realizing like, okay, maybe my expectations are wrong.
Yeah.
And maybe we need to sort of sit down and be like, okay, what is a reasonable expectation? Because at the end of the day, we both need to have energy and enjoyment and want to have desire. And if one person feels resentment for whatever reason, it's not going to work.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
What about when you're with a partner who has experience mismatch? So someone has a lot of partners or has had a lot of partners and the other one doesn't. And for whatever reason, one partner feels some way and the other one feels the other way. And that really affects their sexual relationship.
Yeah, I see this a lot. And it's interesting because there are a lot of folks who will either, on one end, prioritize having a lot of partners and see that as a really positive thing. Then there are some folks who see that as a negative thing. And same with people who don't have a lot of partners. There are some people who think that's really important and other people who will see that as something that is working against them, right, in their dynamics. So one, I think it's so important to, again, remember subjectivity. And what is the meaning that you're both placing on this history that you have or don't have, right? And I just think it's super, super important to remind everyone to remember that you are creating new experiences every time you are sexual with a person. So whether you've had 30 partners or 100 partners or 2 partners, what you're doing with that partner in the moment is new in that experience for you both. So try to see it as something that maybe builds on knowledge that you have from other sexual experiences or that your partner does, but it's something that you are like living here and now in the moment. And can you stay in the present tense with each sexual experience that you have and communicate when you're afraid or when you're nervous about something, or if you don't know how to do something and your partner does, and talk about the meaning that you're making about whether or not your partner does or does not have this experience and how it's shaping your fears about pleasure or your fears about how your partner is going to appraise you or how you might be appraising them.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about communication. It's hard to talk about sex. We don't learn how to talk about sex. So how do you talk about sex?
Well, I think you just start, right? And it gets uncomfortable and messy and awkward. And then you keep going and it gets easier and easier. I don't know about you, but when I first got into this field, I was a lot less comfortable talking about sex. And now that I do it all the time, there's really nothing I can't talk about, right?
Yeah.
But not everyone is in this work. And so it can be really scary to feel like you're going to touch on something that's going to hurt your partner's feelings or maybe blow up a pocket in your relationship or say something that might shift the way you see yourself or the way you believe people will see you. So it can be really scary. But once you just start doing it, you realize that it is a little bit easier than maybe you thought.
Yeah. And it gets easier every time. As you mentioned, I think people think I'm just going to have this one talk and it's going to fix everything. And it's not, right? And just realize like no one taught us how to talk about sex. Like we didn't learn that in school and you don't know how to, your partner doesn't know how to. So you're navigating new treacherous waters and you're sort of like, there may be times where one person shuts down and you just got to stop and come back another day, you know?
Totally.
Are there times when you feel like there's no coming back? Like the communication is so poor, people are too shut down or too maybe have prior traumas or other things that are making it very difficult for people to progress.
Well, in the therapy, I would say that's up to them, right? If they decide it's too much, they can stop at any point in time. And I would hope that they would also have the kind of relationship with their therapist where they might be able to say, hey, I need to pump the brakes a little. This is slow. Therapists want to know that. If you're feeling flooded and you can't or don't want to move into an area of exploration, it's good to tell your therapist that. I think the same is true with partners. And if you have a healthy dynamic together, or a dynamic that is healthy enough, right? I don't like to use this like binary language of healthy or unhealthy, but healthy enough where you can say to one another, like, I need to take a break from this topic for a week, a month, 6 months, right? Can you just honor that with each other? And you might decide, I can't. It's really important to me. I need to move forward. But that's a relationship impasse that definitely warrants exploration. But if the relationship is super important to you, you don't have many choices other than to honor where each other are coming from and what your needs and boundaries are.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's hard. It's really hard. But I think just talking to your partner, if you were the one receiving that information and saying, look, this is really important to me, I will wait for you. But if you feel like we could talk sooner, that would mean a lot to me. Sort of responding in a way that respects them, but also notes like, this is really important to me. And I because I love this relationship where I love us together, I'm willing to wait for you, and not like making them feel guilty about it, but sort of saying like, I'm doing this because I love you, but I would really appreciate if you could think of me. And as you if you start feeling more comfortable sooner, I'd love to talk about it sooner.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's also important if you're the person getting that brake sort of pumped in your direction to say, what do you need from me in this time? Is it helpful if I don't talk about this, or this? Is it helpful if we see a therapist together? Is it helpful to have other kinds of support, right? And really like lean into the process in a way that feels good for the person who does need more time or more space.
So let's talk about cheating.
Ooh.
Why do people cheat? I'm sure you've seen many people who've been on the receiving end or the giving end of cheating. In your experience, why do people do it?
Well, there's a couple of reasons people cheat. Sometimes they are looking for something. They're looking for a connection to a part of themselves that they can't seem to access anymore in their current relationship. Or they're looking to feel something new that maybe they can't experience with their partner because their partner either isn't willing or isn't able to join them in that exploration. Sometimes people do it from a place of resentment. They do it from a place of entitlement or trying to kind of find a reclamation of power or worthiness if they're feeling one down a lot in their partnership. Sometimes people do it because their partner isn't willing to join them in trying a new kink or a new kind of experience, and they want that experience really, really badly. Sometimes it's a place of insecurity, and I think there probably are numerous other reasons too, but those are the main ones that I hear.
Do you think people, when they cheat, it's just like, it just happened in the moment? Like that's what you hear sometimes, right? Like it was just a one-time thing. It didn't mean anything. Do you think that there's a possibility to truth to that?
Well, I think what could be true about that is that maybe it doesn't mean anything about how much they care about their partner, right? Especially if something like alcohol or other substances are involved that alter someone's decision-making or their impulse control. But I think it's really important to recognize that if you're in that place where you're sort of unhappy and you're thinking about it, if you have a moment or a lapse, it's going to be that much easier for you to justify like an oops, right? But typically cheating requires a lot of planning. It requires deception of some kind or the obfuscation of facts or truths. And if it's happening on an ongoing basis, I don't think you can justify an oops, it just happened.
Yeah. Are there differences between men who cheat and women who cheat? The reason I ask is because when you look at biology, during a sexual encounter, there is some data that women have more bonding tendencies with the hormones they release. They tend to bond with the person they had intercourse with. And people can obviously turn that off, so to speak. They can try to psychologically push that away. But there is sort of that emotional bond that sometimes tries to occur, whereas maybe not so much in men, although I think there's still some of that in men. So do you see differences in the reasons between men and women?
I feel a little bit differently about that story, about the biology. Pair bonding is something that people of all biological sex and gender can experience because of oxytocin, vasopressin, as you know, right? And certainly people born in female bodies do have more available to them, but there's so much socialization and context that goes along with the story of being socialized as a woman that create for women a quicker path from that physiological response to the story about what it means. And I think men are socialized in very different ways. So they have a similar physiological response, but they are conditioned to stifle that differently, whereas women are conditioned to experience it and make meaning around it a lot. So,
True. I mean, there are differences in the brain. So when you look at like when the brain lights up during orgasm and how quickly that comes down, we see that all the sort of the dopamine and all the positive sort of hormones last a little bit longer in women than they do in men. So there is a little bit of true variation, in addition to, of course, the socialization that plays a role.
Yeah. There's no doubt that there's differences in the biology in some ways, but I think that they are really amplified and there's so much more meaning attached based on how we're socialized.
Yeah.
And because of how we're socialized, I think that can play a role in the different reasons that people might cheat. But at our core, I mean, a lot of women cheat for the same reasons that men cheat. They want to feel something. They want to feel desired. They are tired of partnering with someone who feels like a dependent. So they want to experience a different kind of interaction. A lot of men feel like if they're sole providers, they feel like, wow, I'm doing a lot for the family and I just need an escape or a release. But we have to remember that culturally, we also have this expectation around like sex. So a lot of men want to be sexual as a way to demonstrate their masculinity. Not all men, of course, but for a lot of men, this is a really important unconscious motivation. And so when they are thinking about being sexual, sometimes it's not about, I want to be in relationship with these other people, but it's more about, I want to feel like a man. And doing this makes me feel that way. Now, that's not a justification, but understanding that can help to understand how there is sometimes like an identity component that factors into the motivations for cheating. Now, women have that too, but I think it's a little bit different. They want to be doted on. They want to be cared for. They want somebody to show up with some energy that feels like they are being the focus, or they are being focused on, right? I think that, there's some crossover, but sometimes those are the ways that it can be different.
Yeah. It's really sad that we get to those points where in your relationship, you either don't feel like a man because you're not valued sexually, I guess, or as a woman, you don't feel desired and the center of someone's attention. You mentioned in one of your podcasts that you were on that like boredom is one of the big causes of low desire that you think people don't realize. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, again, Emily Nagoski just covered this in her book, Come Together. If the sex that you're having is not sex that you're really excited about, the desire that you feel to be sexual isn't going to be there. Because why do you want to have sex that isn't great sex? But mediocre sex can be great too. But I mean, more often than not, if you are feeling sort of bored in your life, bored in your relationship, understimulated sexually, it's going to take a toll on your overall vitality and your overall energy around being creative and being vibrant and leaning into those sort of physical sensations of pleasure.
Yeah. I like to say sex is play. Like it's as adults, we don't play that much, but sex is a place where we can play.
Totally.
So how do you introduce novelty? So I think the cure for boredom is to try something new, right? So what are some things that you suggest to your clients or to people to make that more exciting for them?
Yeah, I think about this as a two-pronged approach. There are the introductions of novel experiences. So bringing in new toys or trying a new fantasy, watching different erotica together, going to a sex club, right? You can go on vacation. You can do lots of things that are new or different or that you just haven't done in a long time. But the other novelty to really think about is, are you in a place of exploring who you are on an ongoing and renewing basis? And same with your partner. Like, part of why we get bored is because we feel too familiar and too safe with our partner, and we stop seeing them as a unique individual, and we start seeing them as like an enmeshed amoeba-like extension of our home life, right?
Yes.
So more psychological distance creates room for more psychological novelty. do the two of you have your own lives? Do you have your own hobbies? Do you have your own friends? Do you have something to share with each other that isn't about what your kid ate for breakfast or what the dog did or didn't do on their walk?
Yeah.
If you're not talking about more interesting things, it might be hard for you to see each other as something different than family.
Yeah.
Right? And we need a little bit of space and air and difference and differentiation to have that erotic tension between us.
Yeah. I also feel like, and this is, I know there's some data on this, but I feel like as a mother, sometimes you get so much love and affection all the time from your children that you're like, I just don't want to be touched. Like,
Yes.
I don't want to be physically loved on, which normally I would really like. But now that I've been hugged and kissed and like all day long, that I just like don't want that. And that's hard, I think, for people to sort of see like, okay, you know, we got to work through that part too. Like, how can we make ourselves be connected without sort of triggering that discomfort?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up. When people do have kids, they often go through this phase of feeling touched out, and it can feel so rejecting to the other partner. And it's not about them. Like you, as you said, you may want to be sexual with them and want it, but physically you're just overstimulated.
Yeah.
And I see this a lot with people who have really high demand jobs and very relational jobs. They sometimes feel relationally touched out too.
Yeah.
Right.
I can relate to that.
Same. So, you know, think about how you can work together as a team to carve out space for that person, that primary parent or that person with a high demand job, to really transition back into being a human.
Yeah.
How do they decompress? What do they need? Do they need an hour of alone time all day or every day, something like that? What do they need to get back in a place where they feel more like themselves first?
Yeah.
And then like somebody who can give sexually to their partner.
That's a really good point. Like, I think everyone has a different way. Like, I know people whose partners like, I need to go to the gym. Like, that's my me time. Some like, I need to take a bath. Whatever it is, like figuring out what that is for your partner and like not making them feel guilty about it.
Exactly.
I just recently, I leave my family to go to social events, to go to work events, but I never leave them for things for me. So like if I want to go to the gym or go to the spa, I feel like this immense guilt. So I try to do it like either with the family, or I'll go to the spa when I'm like on a vacation, like a conference, or if I'm going with other people, because then I'm also doing something with friends. So it feels like worth it. But just me by myself, I have this like real guilt about doing those things. And I'm working through that. But it's also because like people are like, where have you been? You know, like not in a bad way. They miss you. Right. Yeah. And like, mommy, where were you? Like we missed you, or like, or whatever it is. Right. And then you feel like, oh man, I just did that for myself. And I didn't think about someone else, you know?
Yeah, I know. I think a lot of women really, really feel that because we're so socialized to be there for everyone before ourselves. But you know, your kids and your partner get a better version of you when you take care of yourself.
Yeah.
And it might feel like a pang of guilt
Yeah.
in the moment, but in the long run, I think it's a much better strategy.
I agree. We've talked kind of peripherally about kinks. So let's first start about like what's a kink and what are the most common kinks you see in your practice?
So a kink is basically anything that is different than the norm. So like the normative, missionary, or basic few positions of sex. So we can think about a kink as like something that focuses on arousal around a body part. I mean, that might be a fetish too.
Yeah.
It can be a construct or a fantasy, a role play. It can be a scenario. It can be appreciating different kinds of sensations, sometimes even pain, which a lot of people are like, whoa, how can that be hot? But if you think about the way that pain operates in the body, it creates an intensity of sensation, and it also releases a lot of endorphins that can feel really amazing and sometimes even state altering for folks.
And pain actually maps the same areas of the body.
Yeah.
So it's actually interesting. I was just talking to Barry Komisarek, who had a podcast episode on this podcast, and he talked about his researchers on, orgasm and the brain, and how he's like, it's unclear to us still, like what makes a stimulation pain versus pleasure when they both map to the same areas of the brain. So there's a lot of sort of overlap there.
That's really interesting. Well, both of them are nervous system upregulating, right? So it makes a lot of sense that they would be indistinguishable in that part of the brain. Some of the most common kinks that I hear about and work with folks around are things like a foot fetish, not surprisingly, but for a lot of people, it seems so not sexy. But feet can be really sexy for so many reasons. And one hypothesis that's out there is actually because the genitals and the feet in the somatosensory areas of the brain are right next to each other. So there's sometimes a lot of, stimulation that happens in both places. So foot fetishes are probably the most common. Different kinds of role play, like anything around BDSM, it's far more common than I think people want to admit. Because look, we want to play with topics that feel maybe difficult or challenging or exciting or inaccessible in some way in our real lives. So things like power and authority and sensation exchange and just, really playing around with things with ideas, concepts, and emotions that we may not have other avenues to. Like you said, sex is play. So for a lot of folks, changing up their power dynamics is a way to play with feeling humiliated in a safe context, or feeling vulnerable in a safe context, or feeling responsible for someone in a way that is time limited and allows us to feel like we can step into that safely.
That's so interesting. Do you think that there's a certain kind of person that gravitates towards those sort of role playing, like power and vulnerable, being more vulnerable or being shamed versus being the dominant, so to speak, or the powerful one?
I think a lot of what we seek in our sex lives, especially if we're into kinky contexts or fetishes, can represent parts of ourselves that we don't get to experience in our day-to-day lives. So, for example, I've worked with countless high-powered male C-level folks, lots of money, lots of responsibilities, and they love to be humiliated and dominated by women. And it is the only place in their lives where they're not responsible for someone else and where someone else is telling them what to do and making sure that they have some accountability to that. Right? Because in their lives, everyone around them is a yes person and they take orders from them. So, it's one of the areas where they can feel really held and cared for and nurtured, even though it sounds paradoxical.
Yeah, that's interesting. What about fantasy? So very often there's a lot of shame around sexual fantasy because you might have a fantasy, for example, people will say I have a fantasy of being raped, right? Which is like very complex in your head because you're like, I know this is bad. This is not something I would want in real life, but I have this fantasy. Or other sort of fantasies that are sort of on the fringe of what's accepted in terms of society.
Well, I would say our fantasies are not reality, right? By default, they are stories. They are an experience in some beautiful world where nothing is going to happen. So just because you fantasize about something does not mean that you want it in real life, and doesn't mean that if you had that thing happen in real life that you would enjoy it. Our fantasies give us a sense of control. They give us forever agency because we can always just say, nope, no more. That's the line.
Yep.
Right? And so nothing can happen in our fantasies that we are not okay with, which is why fantasies are a great place to explore some of these really complex feelings like forced arousal or consensual non-consent kinks. So not surprisingly to psychologists and sex therapists, but perhaps surprisingly to folks who don't think about or study these things, forced arousal is one of the most popular fantasies for women.
Yeah.
And I think the reason is because in our fantasy, it is safe to feel overpowered by someone's desire, right? And to feel even a little bit scared because it's not happening in real life.
Yeah.
Even if you have that exchange with someone, you're agreeing to the terms, right? You have an out, you're controlling what's going to happen. So it feels like a way to have some autonomy and some power over what in real life can feel really disempowering.
Are you feeling in a rut in the bedroom, wishing you had the kind of sex life you could brag about? I've spent years helping patients and creating content for people all around the world to improve and optimize their sex life. Today, you can get my knowledge for 100% free with my new ebook called Better Sex, Better Life. In this ebook, I review my top 10 tips for improving your sex life, all from the comfort of your own home. All you have to do is go to renamalikmd.com/morepleasure to download it for free today. Do you think, this is one thing that I sort of think about, as you mentioned, that's one of the most common fantasies of women. Very often when they're reading erotic literature, or they want a man who is dominant or who is not asking for permission, so to speak. And so I wonder now, how do you ask for that? If you wanted that from your partner, but now, of course, there's all these important discussions around consent where nobody would ever do that because it could be misconstrued as something negative. Is there something missing? How do people or women ask for that if they want that from their partner?
So I think one of the things to remember is that you're not asking for your partner to overpower you or be dominant in an abusive way. What you're asking for is a reprieve. You're asking for an experience. You're asking for an emotional experience. And how you get there might be different, right? But what you're asking your partner for is to be able to surrender into passion without having to make decisions and think about things. So sometimes that can be an easier way to try to understand what you like, what your partner likes, and how to talk about it, because it can feel really scary, I think, even for a lot of partners to step into that place and be like, I don't want to hurt you.
Yeah.
I don't want to do something that crosses a line because I'm not that person, right?
Right.
And I think those are legitimate conversations to have. So how you set it up with them is to, one, talk about what it is you think is exciting and the why. And then you can both decide in how do you get to the why and what you're really searching for underneath. And then really negotiate together and make an agreement on what's going to happen in that scene, right? Not forever. You're not going to be okay with this forever, potentially. But what do you want to happen in this next sexual exchange that you have? And really be clear with each other on here's what this might look like. Here are my absolute no's, my deal breakers, and develop some safe words and safe gestures so that you can get out of a scenario if it isn't what you thought it would be, or if it starts to become something that no longer feels good or empowering for you. The other thing that's really important is after you play that scene out, to spend a lot of time in aftercare. Because when you engage in those kinds of kinky dynamics, oftentimes for both the doms or the tops and the subs or the bottoms, there can be a trance-like state that occurs. And a lot of endorphins, a lot of adrenaline, a lot of neurochemicals that are flooding your body and feel so good. But when you stop, they come down and you can experience bouts of dysphoria. In fact, there's a term for it called subdrop. So really important to talk ahead of time on what might feel nurturing. How do you want to take care of yourself, each other? Some people like to journal. Some people like to watch comedies together. Some people, serve their partner soup and give them a warm blanket, right?
Yeah.
There's no right or wrong, but really build in that aftercare as an intentional part of the process. And then when you're feeling back to yourselves, really debrief what happened and how you feel about it so that you can take those notes together and use it to improve your next experience.
So what about people who participate, they go through the whole process, they debrief, and then later, either they don't like the feeling that they were so vulnerable in that situation, or they feel regret? How do they handle that?
Yeah, it can happen for sure. I think one, expect that you might have a lot of mixed feelings, especially if it's a newer experience that you're trying to incorporate. And I would say take some time to be reflective around what is the regret. Do you have regret because you feel like you stepped into a version of yourself that's not allowed, which is often what happens? Or is the regret because one or both of you crossed a boundary that you set with each other? That's a different kind of communication to have with your partner. Does it feel regretful because it wasn't as fun as you thought it might be? Well, that's a different reason to kind of have those feelings come up. So I would say take the time to be inquisitive without judgment, right? Without judgment on you or your partner, unless your partner crossed a boundary.
Yeah.
Right? Then it's super important to have that conversation and be really direct about how you're feeling. But if that didn't happen and you're nervous about what this means about you or whether or not it's sustainable to keep doing it again, I work with a lot of folks who experience grief and regret because they really, really loved the experience.
Yeah.
And they're terrified that it's not going to be something within their grasp. And that can bring up a lot of grief that then unleashes a sense of regret, like, why did I even open that door?
Huh. Interesting. Do you feel like there's a way, so say you have a partner who really loves a sort of kink or even a type of sexual encounter, and the other partner is like, eh, or they don't really like it. Is there a way to compromise in those situations?
I think there can be. There can be. And it often starts with, again, getting curious about what is it that you take away from this experience that you love so much? Because maybe it's not about the thing that they're asking, but the feeling that they want to feel. So there are other paths to that feeling that you can get on board with or feel excited about.
Yeah.
But it's super important to think, like, can you show up for your partner's pleasure? If, and really hold space for their pleasure, even if it's not your number one fantasy. And I would say there's a lot of merit in saying, like, okay, tonight we're going to do this thing for you that you really love. And it's not my favorite thing, but I know you really appreciate it. And I want to be a part of that with you.
Yeah.
Right? Versus, I'm really against this, or this is really painful. That's a boundary that I think you should respect.
Yeah.
What
about inviting a third person into your relationship? I know you do a lot of work with polyamorous couples, but also threesomes. And sometimes people have these fetishes, right? Like cuckolding or hot wifery. So let's talk about those.
Yeah, of course. Yesterday was National Threesome Day.
Was it?
It was.
All right.
Yeah. Group sex is one of the most common fantasies that people have. And it makes sense because you have the safety of your partnership if you're in a long-term relationship. Also the novelty of a new person who gets to be an additive component of the desire and the experience that you create together, but it also gets to teach each of you in your long-term partnership something new about yourselves. And that can be really, really exciting. But yeah, monogamy is something that was basically created a while ago. And as human beings, we've generally had the capacity for pleasure from multiple partners. So for a lot of people, they're returning to something that feels like home by bringing in other partners. And, for some folks, it feels really off limits. So I think it just really has to align with whatever the needs of the couples are.
Yeah. So what about in terms of inviting a third into your relationship? Say you're doing a threesome. How do you advise people if that's something they wanted to start doing? Like, how do you advise people to sort of work through that? Because it can be emotionally charged for some people in terms of inviting that person or feeling insecure or those sorts of things.
Yeah. Well, I think it's normal to have a lot of feelings come up that you didn't expect. So one, I would say, give yourselves a lot of grace. And when you start to feel those big feelings come up, slow down. Slow down the process, slow down your communication, right? Really be present with yourself and your partner and validate all of the feelings that come up, because it can open up a maelstrom of emotion that might surprise one or both of you. But, talk about what kind of partner are you seeking, and really get on the same page, as close as you can to being on the same page about who you want to bring in and why, right? Is there a certain role fantasy that you're trying to fulfill, or are you not looking so much about a role and you just want to invite in one or two or three more people, however many? Get clear on that. And then talk about how you both will feel enough safety in the process to forage forward. So does that mean that one of you gets on an app, or does that mean that both of you get on the app and have access? Are you going to hire a sex worker? Are you going to find some friends who are also open to swinging or something? Really talk about what are the parameters that create for you the most safety in the experience together. Prioritizing your partnership if you are a couple that has historically been monogamous and you're trying to introduce some new things, but you plan to stay together.
Yeah. And then what about polyamory? How does one, I guess in your experience, how do people begin to start a polyamorous relationship, and how do people tend to sustain it, particularly in society where this is sort of obviously it's a man-made construct, monogamy, but we sort of think that that's the only way. So how do people navigate that?
Yeah, well, first by starting to really deconstruct a lot of what that means, right? Why is monogamy or the thing that you're comparing yourself to? And a lot of polyamorous folks or folks who are relationship anarchists just really don't believe in it. So once they drop that belief system, that's a lot easier to navigate because now they're talking about just how to, not just, but how to manage the boundaries and the negotiations of having multiple romantic relationships happening concurrently. Some folks set it up so that everyone knows everyone. Some people set it up so that they don't, or maybe they know of each other, but they don't spend time together. And there's really not a right or a wrong way. You have to really think about what do you need? What do the other people involved need? And then find a place of negotiation that makes sense for everyone. And I think, people will kind of tongue in cheek say, well, polyamory is so easy. I'd love to have multiple relationships.
It's really hard.
It's really hard.
Yeah.
It requires such stealth communication and proactive communication. And if you think one relationship is hard, try juggling 2 or 3.
I know. I often think, though, that people who are outside the norm, so homosexual relationships, polyamorous relationships, or people who generally just don't follow the script, right? The script that is told to us, tend to be better communicators because you have to sort of lay these boundaries out very early. So you have to talk about them when you both have the same genitals, right? For example, like one person has to say, like, today I'm going to be the one doing the pleasuring and you're going to be the one receiving. And when you're with multiple partners, you have to make sure you check in with each of the partners and sort of make sure everyone's okay with everything. And so there's a lot of things I think we can learn from those people in terms of how to communicate effectively, whether you believe with their sexuality or their choices for polyamory or whatever it is, right? Like whether you align with that or not, I think there's a lot to be learned.
Totally. And kinky and non-monogamous folks typically score better on overall adjustment and communication scales and relationship satisfaction scales. It's not to say that monogamy and vanilla sex are not great. They are, but they tend to be experienced less consciously because they are the prescription that society gives us. So people who have gone outside of those scripts have had to really work for it. Right.
Yeah.
And they earn a healthier style of communication a lot of the time.
Did you know that choking is now considered vanilla sex?
I did not know that, but that's terrifying. Strangulation.
Yeah.
And it's we have to think about it as strangulation too, because choking is what happens when you have a gobstopper get stuck.
Yeah.
Right. Strangulation is what we're talking about here in sex.
Yeah. So interestingly, I just had Dr. Herbenik on. She's an expert in sort of sexual practices and does a lot of research on how sexual practices have changed over the years. But one of the things she found when researching younger people was that strangulation has become very commonplace. In fact, even in like more common media, they describe it like Jack Harlow's new song where he's like, it's I'm vanilla baby, I'll choke you a little, but I'm no killer baby. Like literally they're making it seem vanilla sex, which is so interesting to me how things have changed.
It is. I think we have a lot of, I think we can attribute a lot of that to what we're seeing in porn, mainstream porn. I mean, it's just become more and more prevalent.
Yeah. What do you think about porn use in relationships and in outside of relationships?
I think erotic material, whether we're talking about like very mainstream porn that's available for free online or paid pornography, written erotica, audio erotica, like there is a lot of benefit that can come from being able to access erotic media. Like human beings have had porn since human beings were human beings.
Yeah.
So this is nothing new, but the way that we have it so accessible to us today is definitely a recent development in our arc of humanity. So I think we could be a little bit more present and conscious with how we consume it, why we consume it, what we're getting out of it, how we make it. But porn will always reflect whatever is in the collective unconscious of the zeitgeist. So what we see in porn is not porn's fault, right? It's our fault.
Because we want it.
Because we want it.
To some degree.
Exactly.
It's being watched, so they keep making it.
Exactly. Yeah. They're
That's so wild.
Yeah. So I think it's got lots of things that we could do better and learn from. And of course, it has a lot of perks and benefits in relationships and outside of relationships.
Yeah. I think some of the things like porn is meant to be just entertainment. So some of those things are really probably not appropriate. Like there's a lot of like sibling intercourse porn and stuff. Like that's not appropriate, right? So we know that there's like genetic abnormalities when you have intercourse and have a baby with someone who's blood related. So that's the reason that's just not appropriate. And so those sorts of things are like, maybe it allows you to have a fantasy, but not necessarily something you would ever act out.
Well, here's a throwback to the conversation we were just having about fantasies, right? More often than not, people do not want to be sexual with their siblings or their step siblings or their step parent, which are very common themes in mainstream porn. What they're actually really turned on by is the taboo of it all.
Yeah.
It's naughty. It's not supposed to be happening. So they're not even excited about the sibling sex. They're excited about the fact that it's something they shouldn't be watching.
Yeah. So interestingly, this comes up a lot in some groups I'm on with other, women my age who are in long-term relationships, and they look at porn as cheating. And I don't hold that viewpoint, but I think it's something you have to discuss with your partner. How do you deal with that when someone, maybe a couple comes to you and one partner feels like porn is cheating, and then maybe the next step would be like going to a strip club is cheating?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think every partnership has its own fidelity agreements. And when you're setting those fidelity agreements, it is really important to be curious about why something is like it would be dangerous to the partnership. Because I think a lot of the time we get into relationship and we expect the relationship to define us in a certain way. And so when we conflate the health of our relationship with our identity or the way we believe ourselves to be viewed and seen in the world, that's when we start to get extra controlling around what's happening in that relationship. But I think there's a lot of merit to the concerns that some people have when their partner is distracted in the relationship by something else, like porn or going to strip clubs. And if they're not able to prioritize that intimacy in their partnership, then it does feel like a third that's getting in the way. And it's understandable. And I would have the same concerns if it were golf or if it were knitting or if it were watching Star Wars every Saturday. Like, what is happening that your intimacy is getting deprioritized? What is that about? And I think when couples get to a place where they can understand that, then it is easier to make room for some things like porn or, other kinds of experiences that may have felt really threatening before.
Yeah. So I think really understanding why you find that threatening and why the other person is using it and making space for like, okay, maybe it's not so, in some cases, maybe it's not so threatening to your relationship, but you have some insecurities about it. And other times, maybe it really is threatening because they're prioritizing that over being with you.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think that's really important. That comes up all the time.
It does.
It really does.
But I think that also reflects a lot of like purity culture values that a lot of folks take into relationship with them. Like, we are now responsible for each other's sexual well-being. And like, that is a lot of pressure.
That's a lot.
And a lot of, that's a lot of like confinement. And it's not realistic to police your partner's fantasies. In fact, it's really unhealthy.
Yeah, like what if they fantasize about someone else? It doesn't mean anything about your relationship.
It doesn't. No, I fantasize about so many things.
Same.
And so many people.
Yeah.
And my partner and I are able to talk about that. And we kind of laugh about it. And he does the same thing,
Yeah. I think that's really important. And realizing like we don't expect our partners to be everything to us. Like we don't expect them to be our girlfriend that goes shopping with us. We don't expect our partner to be the person we gossip with. Like we have different people for different parts of life, and we have them for a part of our sexuality. But that doesn't mean that they have to be all of our sexuality. And like looking at other people or watching pornography and maybe even going to a strip club may not be a negative thing for that person. It may just be an expression of their sexuality, but they still prioritize you and want you as their sexual partner, right? But again, realizing within your own relationship context what that means for them is really important, because sometimes it could be that they're doing this and they prefer this over being with you. And then that's a problem.
Yeah. Well, and it also can sometimes exacerbate like other dynamics going on in the relationship. Like if someone is watching a lot of porn or they're going to a strip club and they're coming home to their partner and they're saying, well, you don't do these things.
Yeah.
And you don't look like that. That's really problematic behavior. And I would say, in fact, that it's not the strip club or the porn that is causing the problem. It's the partnership and the attitude there that is happening, right? The entitlement that's happening.
Do you think people can forgive a partner who's cheated?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I said that really enthusiastically. No, they can. It can take a lot of work, but yeah, I've seen a lot of partnerships not only survive infidelity, but become so much stronger and so much more connected because they've understood that the infidelity is a symptom of something, and they've been able to look at it and investigate it together and use it as fodder to grow closer.
Yeah. Do you think the adage, once a cheater, always a cheater, do you think that's true?
No, I think for some people, like there definitely is an ingrained expectation that they should be able to do whatever they want. There's a lot of entitlement for some folks, but that's not always the case. And that's not always what drives infidelity. So I think we have to look at people's intrapsychic organization as well as what's happening interpersonally and think about like the gestalt of who they are and who they are as partners.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I've actually seen some of my friends survive infidelity and have much stronger relationships for it. But it's interesting. Like I said, I'm in these groups where somebody will say, my partner cheated on me. Should I leave them or him or whatever? And the almost always gut reaction is yes from 90% of the people. And I think that can be really damaging sometimes because sometimes there's a lot there that's worth saving. Yeah. And I've heard you say this before, sex therapy is a lot cheaper than a divorce. This is sort of one of the places where you can use sex therapy, but what are other flags or signs that people should be like, hey, you know what? We might benefit from sex therapy.
Yeah, well, I'm biased, obviously, right? Because this is what I do for a living. But I'm also such a champion of therapy in general. I think that therapy and sex therapy can be great proactive steps to take to really sit down, if you have the time and the resources to do it, of course. Not everyone does. But I think they can be really, really important proactive places to talk about these things. Because as you said earlier, we're not taught how to talk about sex. And a lot of folks go into their long-term partnerships with a lot of expectations about what sex should and should not look like. And I'm using those shoulds because they're often these scripts that don't really make much sense for their realities. So I think sex therapy is a great place for you and your partner to talk about, like, what do we want? What does sex mean to us? How do we negotiate it? How do we experience it? How can we develop it more? What are the dimensions of sex for us? So that's one approach. But a lot of folks come to sex therapy because of infidelity, but also because their bodies aren't acting the way they want them to. So erectile dysfunction or early ejaculation or a difficult time with having an orgasm or a delayed orgasm, pain during penetration or sex. So I think it can be a place to address a concern. It can also be a place to become more expansive. So a lot of folks start out in sex therapy because they want to get kinky. They don't know what it means about them. It doesn't mean anything about you, by the way. It's just something you want to try, and that's great.
It's just play.
Just play. Just play. It means that you're adventurous. I love that for you. Let's talk about it. So they want to explore kink, or they want to open a relationship or get into non-monogamy in some way. So I think it's a place where people can have the conversations about sex that they've never been able to have before and step into a completely different relationship with sexuality.
Yeah. I will say that I think every person with any sexual problem, whether it's like you mentioned, erectile dysfunction, pain with sex, any of those things, even when they have a biologic problem, right? Like they have blood flow problem or they have a problem with their pelvic floor, any sort of etiology that might be causing this problem, I tell everyone you can benefit from sex therapy because when you have a problem with sex, your brain starts ruminating, starts stressing, starts catastrophizing about that issue and brings it to every sexual encounter. And so I tell everybody, like, if you have the time and the means, please see a sex therapist. I will help you find one. Like, because I think it's so important and so valuable. And I wish one of my goals in life is to make this sort of thing very accessible to people, because I'm like, if everyone had access to affordable sex therapy, like, I think the world would be a better place.
Oh my gosh, 100%.
Yeah.
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 Because not only do we take those problems into every sexual experience that we have, a lot of the time they bleed into other parts of our non-sexual lives too. If someone's feeling insecure about erectile dysfunction or early ejaculation, that may be having them question their confidence in general. And that can bleed into their work life, into their friendships, into their romantic relationship, even into like things like road rage, right? Like, our sex is integrated into who we are. And so when there's something that feels wonky there, it can have pretty big effects in every other part of our lives.
It's pervasive.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about early ejaculation. I get a lot of questions about early ejaculation and delayed ejaculation. Now, there are some biologic causes of this, but I think there's a lot of value in sex therapy around these things. So tell us how you deal with those issues.
Well, it really depends on what is the underlying cause for someone, but a lot of the time, if there's not a biological explanation for what's happening, there is typically a disconnect between mind and body, and that person needs some coaching and some experience to help them learn different exercises to recognize the arc of inevitability in their body and pay attention to it closer and learn how to activate their body and their pelvic floor muscles and different things in different ways so that they can slow themselves down before they reach that point of inevitability. And really that's about building up that mind-body connection and becoming more present, more interoceptive, so perceptive of your internal cues, and being able to, get out of your head and into your body more.
It's a big problem.
Yeah.
It's very stressful. I mean, all of these issues are very, very stressful for anyone dealing with sexual dysfunction. I mean, the stress, I mean, we've sort of talked about this, but the trauma it even causes, right? Like, it can be deep-seated trauma from having bad experiences in the past, and that needs to be worked through as well. Yeah. Some people asked about hands-on learning. So what does that mean? And do all sex therapists offer it? What is that?
Sex therapists do not have sex with their clients. That is not a service that we offer.
Yeah.
But sex therapists can work in a triadic model with a client and with a surrogate partner therapist who does work with somebody in the moment, in person, to actually put into practice different things. It's a very intentional model. This is not like sex work where you just go and pay someone and have sex with them. It's a process, and a surrogate partner therapist will work with a sex therapist in conjunction with the client to help them reach the goals that they have set. And that can be really valuable for folks who maybe don't have a partner or who are really struggling to approach their partner with something or be in the moment with their partner around a concern that they have. But sex therapists do not have sex with their clients. That's probably one of the number one questions I get asked, especially from men.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so these surrogate partners, so they will mimic the sexual experience. Like, what is their role?
So a surrogate partner therapist will have many different kinds of physical intimacy with a client, in addition to helping them slow down and be present emotionally in the moment. So they'll take a lot of what the sex therapist and the client talk about and process and discuss as options or insight development opportunities, and maybe even skills that the sex therapist has instructed the client on how to do and then invited them to go do on their own. But there's only so much you can do on your own. If what you're struggling with is something that happens only when you're with a partner. So a surrogate partner therapist can help that person in the moment put into practice with a partner all the things that they've been learning with the therapist. So working in this triadic model with a sex therapist and a surrogate partner therapist can be a way that people can take the talk therapy and put it into practice before bringing it to a partner in real life.
And then if people say they have disabilities or these surrogate partners work with those individuals as well?
Absolutely.
Because sometimes those people really struggle because they don't have a partner, and they also are disabled in certain ways where they can't put all the same things into practice.
Absolutely. Yeah. Surrogate partner therapist and a sex therapist, again, in that triadic model, can help folks like really get into a sexual experience or navigate disabilities in a way that feels really empowering.
So I don't know the exact statistics, but the majority of the sex therapists I've met are women. I'm also a woman. I'm a female urologist. And I often find that patients are a little bit nervous or hesitant, particularly male patients, when they come to see me. And I find that maybe that's similar. And when they come to see you, what sort of reassurances do you provide them? I think it would allow people to feel a lot more comfortable going to see a sex therapist, just because a large majority of the ones they're going to see are female. Maybe you know the statistics, but
I don't know the stats on that, but I will say a lot of men actually find it to be more reassuring to work with a female provider because they find it easier to talk to women. They aren't so worried about how they're going to be judged for their sexual questions or concerns. So that's not always the case that it brings up fear, but definitely it can. And I think when that happens, it's super important to let that be known to your provider because, first of all, sex therapists, we're trained to work with folks across so many different things. And there's really not a lot that you can say that's going to surprise us at this point. And we are trained to be non-judgmental. So we're here to help you work through the anxiety that might be coming up, because if it's happening with your therapist, it's probably also happening in your real life with other partners that you're with. So I think it's a really important thing to speak into the ether of your work with a therapist so that they can help you navigate that and help you develop more trust in them and in the process, because that's really a collaborative process.
Yeah, that's great. How can someone find a sex therapist? And then how can someone find that triadic model if that was something that we're looking for?
To find a sex therapist, I would recommend going to asect.org. It's AASECT.org. ASECT is not the only, but it is one of the biggest credentialing organizations for sex therapists. So when someone has an ASECT certification, they've gone through lots of additional coursework, training, supervision, addressing different biases, and like really work to remediate and eliminate biases. So they are somebody who has done the work. So I would start there. And then if surrogate partner therapy is something that you're interested in, I would talk to your sex therapist about that, because most surrogate partner therapists will require somebody to be in sex therapy so that that model is really there to support them and support the process.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. What's something that you think society really doesn't know enough about in terms of sexual health, sex therapy?
I wonder if this is true for you too, but one of the things that really kind of blew my mind is I have worked within the mental health and sexuality space now for almost 20 years, is how important sex is, but also how not important sex is, right? And what I mean by that is we put a lot of meaning on sex and expect sex to carry a lot of things for us in terms of our well-being, our worthiness, our social currency in the world. And when we do that, we're doing sex a disservice because we are over-prioritizing it, right?
Yeah.
So I would say one of the things that people really benefit from learning sooner rather than later is that sex is an activity. Yeah. It's something fun that you can do. Hopefully it's fun, right? Hopefully it feels good.
And if it doesn't, see somebody.
Yeah, we'll definitely address that. Like it should feel good more often than not. But it's just an activity that we do. It's play, it's silliness, it's pleasure, it's relieving, it's connecting. It can be all the things, but it doesn't define who we are as people. And I think that's a trap that a lot of folks fall into.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People definitely identify as their sexual beings, which is, fine. But when it causes stress and anxiety, then it's not so fine.
Exactly.
Okay. So we end the podcast with a few questions that we ask everybody.
Okay.
What is a non-negotiable, something you do every day?
Ooh, take my dog for a walk.
Okay.
Multiple walks.
That's good. It's good for you and the dog.
It's necessary.
What is a health hack or life hack you would share?
I would say do something to be in your body every single day, even if it's just for a few minutes, but to be present in your body, not just going to the gym and working out and doing the high intensity stuff. That's great. That stuff can be great, but like really be present with what am I feeling in my body right now?
Yeah. Listen, hear, feel, all the sensations. What is something you know now in your life that you wish you knew earlier?
We are responsible for the sex life that we have, right? And that means many different things, but we can curate a lot more pleasure if we take responsibility for bringing pleasure into our lives. I think when I was younger, I expected that my sex life would be good if there was something magical between my partner and I. And when I was younger, what that meant for me is that I didn't take as much responsibility in getting education about my sexuality or about sexual health practices. I didn't think about what I actually wanted and needed, and I sort of punted to whatever my partner was bringing to that experience as being the default for the experience. So really kind of taking more responsibility for pleasure and for boundaries can give you the kind of sex life that feels really, really fun and exciting.
Yeah. And what's one thing you would change about the world?
I wrote an article a couple of years ago called Be a Slut for the Sake of World Peace. And
I'm sure that was controversial.
Yeah. And what I mean by that is when we embrace more sex positivity, we really challenge a lot of the systemically oppressive systems of power that exist in our world. And that creates a lot more peace and equanimity and I think happiness.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
When you have more pleasure, you're more happy.
Exactly.
All right. So where can people find you?
Oh, probably my website is the best place, modernintimacy.com, especially if you want to have a free consultation with myself or anyone on my team. We are in 8 states right now for therapy, and we have coaches who practice internationally. And then my social media, at Dr. Kate Balestrieri on Instagram, TikTok, and at Modern Intimacy on YouTube.
And she has a podcast.
And I have a podcast, Get Naked with Dr. Kate.
Yes. Great name, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Rena Malik MD podcast. If you're enjoying this podcast, a really easy, zero-cost way to support us is by leaving us a rating or review on your favorite podcast platform or subscribing to the channel on YouTube. You can also learn more from me on my other social media platforms on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, X, and more. And as always, remember to take care of yourself because you're worth it.